Welcome to another video. In today's video, I'll be doing my March wrap-up video, and I'm just gonna say this now. I finished only 2 books in the month of March. I'm slightly disappointed because I wanted to read 3 books in March, but at least it wasn't a February situation where I read nothing. So I am, you know, still proud of myself that I managed to finish 2. Also, I did watch 3 movies that I will include in this wrap-up as well. So I guess without further ado, we'll get straight into the wrap-up. If you watched my February wrap-up, you probably already know what book I'm gonna say first up that I finished. It is The Blade Itself by Abercrombie. This is the first book in the First Law trilogy. I don't know if I mentioned this before in a previous video, but I've owned this one for quite some time now. It's been a few years, so I finally got around to it. I have to say I was slightly disappointed. Now don't come at me for saying that. Like, I still enjoyed the book. If you guys don't know about the First Law trilogy, it is one of the more famous grimdark fantasy series, and so I don't know, there's a lot of fans for this one, and I will say that I had hyped it way too much in my head. I thought that this was gonna be like an amazing book that I'm just gonna fall in love with and just be on board with this series. I am on board with the series, but I think there are a few aspects that I was slightly disappointed by, but in terms of characters, definitely top notch. I think it would only go uphill from this book and onwards, so I am very excited to continue on with the series. So I'm not saying that it sucks and I hate it. I was only just slightly disappointed by what I had expected from the first book at least. I'm sorry, the sun is like so bright right now. It's like reflecting off the floor and it's making me look... Okay, anyway, I'm just gonna move on. So if you guys don't know about this series, basically the reason why I was a little bit disappointed with this series, it's because that it was pretty much a setup book. Like, I believe the future books in the series are gonna expand in the world building, expand the story and this overarching plot, because I think a lot of the things that happen in this book was just planting the seeds, the chess pieces if you will, for what's to come in the future. And so you are following, how many characters is it? I think it's about 4 or 5 different perspectives, and at the beginning of the series these characters are kind of in various different locations, so they're not together, but by the end their pathways kind of align and they kind of come together in a sense. And so they are located in all these different areas of the world, but it still seemed like a very self-contained story, and so that aspect I was wanting a little bit more, because if anything in a fantasy, I do want to have expansive world building. At least that's what I enjoy, and so I was kind of like a little bit disappointed that this was very like self-contained, even though it's set in numerous different locations. But I also feel like a lot of the characters like kind of skipped over their traveling, even though they're in like different locations that are supposedly very far away from each other. One chapter they were here and then the next chapter they're in this different city, so I'm like, oh okay, we just kind of like skipped over like their journey. I kind of understand because it's already kind of like a big book and I'm sure they can expand on the world, and I feel like Abercrombie is going to expand the world more and more as the series goes on. And I know the First Law trilogy is a trilogy, but I'm pretty sure he has a few series that's set in the same world, and there's like 10 books I think. I am very excited to see where this series goes. As much as I said that I'm a little bit disappointed with the overall story, how it just felt like pretty much a big setup, I loved the character development. So if you're a big fan of like character central stories, then you'll be a big fan of The Blade Itself, because more than the world building and the plot, like the overarching plot, Abercrombie did focus more on each individual characters and flesh them out. They're very much different from each other, which is very refreshing, because I think so often when you read a series with multiple point of views, you kind of feel like, oh, some characters kind of sound the same, but these are very distinct personalities and different characters. Some of the characters are a little bit despicable. All the characters fit into a grey area, so none of them them are like particularly good or really bad. You kind of feel for everyone's characters, and that's, I think, how he writes really well in terms of fleshing out his characters, because you kind of feel for them even though they're kind of awful, but you kind of root for them as well. And so yes, I very much enjoyed the character aspects of this story, and in terms of seeing this as like its standalone book, I think it kind of lacked in other areas, but characters is top notch. I was very much invested and I'm very much eager to follow these characters in their journeys ahead. So I am really excited to continue on with the series, and I'm glad that I finally read this beast, even though, okay, it's not like the biggest fantasy book, but it's like over 500 pages. It was a struggle, and the reason why it was a struggle, halfway through the book, like the characters are still doing their own things. I'm like, okay, where's the plot going? I'm not really engaged because there's nothing much happening, even though there's subtle hints of political maneuverings in the background, but in the forefront it's more like each character's day-to-day lives and like what they're dealing with. It was very slow, hence why it took me like 1.5 months to finish this book, but I'm so glad that I did, and I'm very much excited. And I still need to pick up the second book because I only own like the first one, and so I am eager to pick up the second and continue on with the series. I did give this one a 3 out of 5 stars on Goodreads. Not a bad rating, just saying I enjoyed it. I enjoyed it, and if I could put a half star, it would probably be like 3.5 stars for me. But there's not much more to say about it without spoiling it, and yeah, I don't know if I should do a review of this book or not, but we shall see. We shall see. The second and last book that I read, because The Blade itself took most of March to read, but fear not, I made it. This really scraped by, and I finished Before the Coffee Gets Cold by Toshikazu Kawaguchi. And this book is kind of magical realism, speculative fiction. It was such a nice read, and I'm so pleased that I finally found a book by a Japanese author that I've enjoyed, because every time I try a book that's by a Japanese author, I've always struggled and I've always been kind of disappointed. But for some reason this one, I don't know if it's the translation that was spot on, it kind of flowed very beautifully. This is a book that's set in Tokyo, and it is self-contained in one location. There's this cafe that kind of allows its visitors to travel back in time, and that's where the magical realism element comes into play. However, there are certain rules that you need to follow, and there are very much limitations to what you can do when you travel back in time. So there's only one specific chair that you can sit at that allows you to travel back in time, and while you're traveled back in time, you can't leave that chair, you can't walk out of the cafe or anything. You can only go back to moments within the cafe and what's happened in the past. Also, anything you do in the past won't affect the present, and of course the title suggests you have to be back before the coffee gets cold. And so this story has a realistic setting. It's set in like the modern day real world, but it has this slight magical element entwined into the story. This one's a very quick read, it's very short, and you basically only have 4 chapters following 4 different individuals that visit the cafe. You do get perspectives from the visitors and also the staff that work at the cafe. Each chapter kind of follows different people and their lives and their reasoning for why they want to travel back in time to the past, whether it is something that they need to fix or like ask. And it's very human. I feel like even though this cafe does have the ability to go back in time, the time traveling element is very much used in a very realistic way. These people really only want to go back in time because they want to figure out something in their lives or a moment that they want to relive and know certain things about. It's kind of raw and honest, and I just felt for the characters a lot. I guess some characters it's like, it's kind of stupid, but some characters it's very touching. There are moments where it can be a little bit heartbreaking, and so I felt like this was kind of, I don't know if I should say that it's kind of a wholesome and cute read, which it's not, because you do have this magical realism setting, but it's not all, you know, happy at the end. You're following these characters who are dealing with real life struggles past, and so they're pretty much going back in time in order to not change the present, because you can't do anything in the past that can affect the present, but it is helping them come to somewhat of a resolution where they can move on with their lives and kind of have this sense of closure. I found that very, very touching and not inspiring, but kind of heartwarming in a sense, where there are moments of tragedy or sadness, but it comes out in a positive manner. And I just thought that this was a positive read and I highly enjoyed it. It was very wholesome, and because it is set over like a few different characters and it's kind of almost repetitive, you're following different characters who are trying to travel back in time. In a way, it's kind of like a series of short stories, but at the same time it kind of interlinks into the overall story of the book, and so it's not really a series of short stories, but it kind of feels like it is, if you get what I mean. And so I highly enjoyed it. I think it's a nice quick read if you want something a little bit lighter and a little bit more wholesome. I thought that this was such a good book to taking a break from something like a grimdark fantasy, and I just thought that this was such a nice read, and it was certainly a quick read if you guys are interested in looking out for something that's gonna pick you up a little bit. This one's so cute, and look at the cover. It's so cute. Oh my gosh, I am obsessed. Honestly speaking, I actually bought, I don't know if it's the sequel, but on Goodreads it was put as book 2. So I had initially bought that book thinking that that was the first book. This one was set as number 1, and so I was like, okay, I can't read that until I, you know, read the first book, or I don't know if it's even a series or not, but I ended up purchasing this one so I could read it and then read the sequel. I don't know if it's a sequel or if it's just like a series of short stories that are set in the same cafe again, but I am so pleased to have enjoyed before the coffee gets cold. So yeah, these were the 2 books that I managed to finish during the month of March. I know it's a little bit disappointing, but I am still happy that I managed to finish 2 books at least. So yes, let's just move on to the movies that I watched during the month of March. Excuse me while I open up my letterbox. I think I mentioned this in a previous video, but Letterboxd is kind of like a Goodreads but for movies. You can kind of like rate and review movies. It's so handy, and I have like this diary where I log in every time I watch a movie, so it's pretty handy to keep up with what I watch. And so yes, okay, even though I mentioned WandaVision in my February wrap up, officially WandaVision finished I think like the first week of March. I believe it's the first week, and so yeah, I ended up finishing WandaVision. It was good, I enjoyed it. I won't go into further detail because I talked about it in my February wrap up, and so you can check that one out if you haven't already. However, during the month of March, I was pretty bad. I didn't watch any movies until the last few days before March had ended. The very first movie I would like to mention is The Wailing. So The Wailing is a Korean movie. This is a rewatch for me, but I had a friend of mine who was too scared to watch it, but then like she really wanted to watch it, so I was like, okay, I'll watch it with you. So I ended up watching it with my friend. This movie is directed by Na Hong-jin, and I don't think this director has a huge list of movies that he's directed, but this was like the first movie I've watched by him and completely loved the first time I watched it. I was like so into it. I was telling my co-workers to watch it. I was telling my friends to watch it, even though most of my friends don't like horror movies. Oh, I forgot to mention it is under the category of the horror genre, but honestly speaking, it's not scary. It's more unsettling and creepy is what I should say. And so I had a blast the first time round when I watched it, and the second time there are certain details that I just didn't pick up in the first watch, but now, because I was really into it, like there was all these theories that I was getting into, and so after reading about it and rewatching it, I did pick up a lot of different details that I wouldn't have picked up the first time watching it, and so I was so happy. It's beautifully directed, like the shots are gorgeous. It's basically following this kind of country bumpkin cop in a rural country village where suddenly there's a series of murders that occur in this village, and we're trying to solve this mystery with this cop who is pretty much a useless cop, and so you're trying to solve this mystery and there are potentially supernatural elements that are at play with why these murders are occurring, because each murder cases, one of the villager goes crazy and ends up murdering their whole family. And so it's very brutal, very dark, but honestly it's something that I would highly recommend you guys watching. It's one of my favorite horror movies. I mean, there's a few horror movies that I really enjoy, but this was like a subtle sort of horror, and it's more human because you're dealing with people who have like a certain fear of someone other, but it also has elements of a possession sort of story. But like most Western movies, it's kind of like Catholicism and exorcism through like the Catholic religion, but in the Wailing they're using like shamanism and like very almost pagan way of doing exorcism and stuff, and it's really like creepy, and I don't know, I was just so unsettled by it. And the acting, oh my gosh, I will have to say the acting is amazing. I was so blown away by the acting in it, even though like this cop is way out of his element with these really crazy murders that are going on in this village. You kind of feel so bad for every character in this movie. Like, it's so tragic. I would say it's a very traditional Korean sort of movie, but at the same time I feel like it can appeal to international viewers. I rated The Wailing 4 out of 5 stars on Letterboxd. Please go watch it if you're into horror. Definitely watch it. If you're not into horror, I would still kind of recommend it to you guys because it's just such a good watch. It's so good, and it kind of makes you contemplate and analyze it after you've watched the movie, if you know what I mean. It's kind of like a movie that you're kind of thinking about way after you watch it. So I don't know, I would recommend it for non-horror watchers as well. And so right after we watched that, we ended up watching one of his other movies. The next movie that I watched was The Yellow Sea, and again this is directed by Na Hong-jin. As much as I love The Wailing, I would have to say I was slightly disappointed with The Yellow Sea. So The Yellow Sea though, it has a lot of raw imagery and a lot of brutal realities of our main character situation, and so I love the rawness, but it's also very confusing, the plotline. I think also The Wailing was slightly confusing as well, but I think The Yellow Sea was really confusing where I didn't really care to analyze. Basically, the story opens up in the border of like China and North Korea. So it's kind of following a North Korean who escaped into China, and so he's going through a rough patch. Our main character loaned money and then got his wife out to go to South Korea, but he's still stuck in this really dodgy, slummy area in China, and he's being hunted by loan sharks, and he's really down in the dirt. He's in severe debt. He's trying to make money in order to go to South Korea and follow his wife. I think he somehow manages to get a job to assassinate someone in South Korea. So he gets flown over there, attempts to kill someone to get money in order to like pay off his debt. Without spoiling the movie, I would say it goes in a direction you don't expect, and he gets tangled up in like a gang war, like a gang feud, and it's just so crazy and intense. It's almost like he's had a bad day and it only gets worse as it goes on. And so even though he went to South Korea to do one thing, it kind of leads to like this bigger thing. I think it's set within 10 days or like a week, but it's just day after day his situation just gets worse and worse, and you just feel so bad for him. I just thought that the plot line was a little bit more confusing. You didn't really care much for any of the other characters. Maybe our main protagonist you're kind of rooting for, but no one's really that good of a person, so everyone's in a morally gray area. And also I have to say that it's super violent because you're kind of dealing with different gangs and stuff. Like, it gets pretty violent. The action is pretty intense. It's very suspenseful, and I do enjoy that. One criticism I'd like to highlight is the shaky cam. Like, oh my gosh, this movie has shaky cam like no tomorrow. I think there was only like 1 or 2 scenes in the whole movie where the camera's not, you know, shaking. It gave me honestly a headache just watching it. I gave The Yellow Sea 3 out of 5 stars on Letterboxd, mainly because I did enjoy the raw, brutal, gritty reality that was portrayed in the movie. I did like the action, I like the suspensefulness of like the chases, but I think where this film lacked having a clearer plot line, and it was very confusing to follow what was going on, why these gangs were like quarreling against each other and who's backstabbing who. It was like plot twist after plot twist, and I'm like, there's too many plot twists now, and I'm lost. And so in that sense, it's kind of annoying to follow what's going on. It was a slight disappointment after watching The Wailing. It's a very different tone and it's very different vibes, you know? Like the two movies, I wouldn't even know that it was directed by the same guy. It's very different the way it's filmed. I don't know if I would recommend The Yellow Sea though. It was just okay and I wasn't that impressed by it. I am intrigued to watch his other film called The Chaser. I think it's called The Chaser or Chaser. I'm intrigued to see what this director does in the future. And the last movie that I watched in the month of March, it was Raya and the Last Dragon. I was so excited to watch this movie. I did like a trailer reaction for this and everything. I was so hyped. It's kind of got a Southeast Asian setting. It was a fantasy. It was supposed to have loads of action. And then the movie was released. And then I started seeing so many like negative reviews on Raya and the Last Dragon that I was like skeptical going into it. I was kind of disappointed by how many negative reviews were out there, and I was like, no, I was like rooting for this movie. I feel like Disney did Asians dirty when Mulan came out, like the live action Mulan came out. It was pretty horrendous. I was really rooting for the next Asian centric Disney movie to do really well, and it kind of bombed as well. And so I'm like really disappointed, but I had a fun time. Like I actually had a fun time watching Raya and the Last Dragon, that I'm a little bit sad that most people find it not that enjoyable. But at least after watching it, I formed my own opinions on it. Like I do understand the criticism it got, but at the same time I enjoyed it for what it was as well. It's one of the first Disney movies that I can remember that doesn't have like musical numbers, but in its place it like has fight scenes, which I am all about because I love action in movies. And so I was so impressed by the action sequences, and also the animation was so beautifully done. The world was so colorful and so beautifully presented and portrayed. I would say that some elements that could have been stronger were like characters. That's where it kind of falters a little bit. But the story is very simple. Like this bad thing happens and our main character is trying to fix this situation. And so I don't think it had to do anything that elaborate. I don't want to say much more about it because it might go into like spoiler territory, but I enjoyed it. The animation was beautiful. The fight sequences are really intense, and I feel like they incorporated like different like fighting techniques as well that are from Southeast Asian cultures and whatnot, and all those elements were so beautifully animated, and so I was so impressed by that. It was an adventure story. It was very like kind of upbeat, has kind of like tragic moments as Disney movies and Pixar movies always incorporate into their stories. It's got a bit of tragedy, and so yeah, I overall enjoyed it. Also, it's not a remake, it's a totally new concept, and so I do appreciate when Disney kind of incorporates other cultures and makes a story that's central to other cultures aside from the Western cultures, you know? It's heavily inspired by Asian culture and the Asian fantasy lens, and so I very much appreciated that too. I did give Raya and the Last Dragon 3.5 stars out of 5. It was above average for me and I enjoyed it. I would recommend. I am a little bit bitter. Like I said, I'm sad that it didn't get a lot of hype. People weren't that excited about it, and yeah, people just don't even know about it for some reason, and so that like breaks my heart and I am upset. But look, I support you, Raya. Anyway, that's it guys. I rambled on for way too long. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. What are your opinions on some of the books or movies that I watched? Have you guys seen them or read them? Let me know in the comments down below if you're excited for any of them. Let me know also. I will see you in my next video. Thanks for watching again, and yeah, hope you guys are staying safe and happy reading. Bye!